in this particular group, this is the only one that we have. So it's the document that we have in this second group. So the Acts of the Apostles. So note, actually the text has no title from the author. So it was the later church writers who dubbed it as Acts or deeds, at least as soon as they were able to get to know the contents of the documents. So this is implicitly compared to Hellenistic writings of the same name, and usually this kind of writing would describe the career and accomplishments of famous men. The phrase of the apostles in Acts of the Apostles may not actually be precise, for the simple reason that in the text only two major figures are basically given space and attention here. One is Peter, one of the 12, and is prominent in 9 or 10 chapters. The rest of the book basically is you have Paul, only twice called an apostle and appears first with Barnabas, and in 17 chapters is very prominent. He's at the center of it. That's why it's not accurate or precise to call it Acts of the Apostles when only two practically are really mentioned and the rest are just sometimes mentioned in passing. So that's why scholars would prefer the designation occasionally as Acts of Peter and Paul. But so as not to confuse people, they just basically accepted the name Acts of the Apostles for this particular document. But it's good to know that that particular name is not what do you call this, did not come to us together with the original text of this particular book. So it was just added to it by writers and scholars of the later time. So that's as far as designation is concerned. Regarding the contents, of course, together with the first volume, which is the Gospel of Luke, here in the second volume, it talks about the history of the origins of the Christian faith. Now, when we say history, you have to more or less try to take with a grain of salt the meaning of history we're talking about here. Because when we're talking about strictly historical, then we might have a problem with justifying that for the sake in relation to the Acts of the Apostles, because there have been questions regarding the historical accuracy or reliability of the Acts of the Apostles. Of course, we could still say it talks about some events in the past, true, and it's to a certain degree one of these aspects could be historical, but we could not actually say that it is a history book, because anyway, that was not the intention of the writer behind it. Now, the content would begin in Jerusalem at the Ascension and then at Pentecost, and eventually ends in Rome. So, and literally dozens of stops in between. So it's considered as a theological history in which God, especially the Spirit of God, plays a primary role. And at the same time, it is also called selective history. So that's Acts of the Apostles. It is history, all right, but the interest or the perspective, the bias is theological, and that's the reason also why it is selective in its historical account. It only brings into the story materials that are helpful in portraying the beginnings of the Christian faith. Now, in spite its title, we already mentioned that it does not tell us all about the apostles. So early part would deal with Peter and few others, while the second part focuses on Paul or Saul. Now, the self-conscious agenda in the text is located in chapter 1, verse 8. So it's not about early Christian missionary heroes, as usually what is expected in an Acts or deeds, but the spirit. So the agenda of the Acts of the Apostles is the Spirit-empowered spread of the gospel from Jerusalem to Judea Samaria, and the ends of the earth. So that means basically from Jerusalem and then to all places possible. The evangelist theological agenda and literary artistry were given more emphasis in the crafting, in the analysis and study of this particular document. Luke, again, as author, was not equated with a companion of Paul. It's so difficult to really identify whether we're looking at the same Paul. Recently, I mentioned already that the historical value of Acts has been put to question for some time, but there is already a renewed interest today in the historical value of Acts, especially in its first century context. So it is basically observable without discounting the theological interest of the authors behind it. So even if we cannot say that it is, even if it's not a historical book or a book of history, but we can also basically get some information about some historical events or incidents that had happened in the history of the people, especially about the first century context. Now, I mentioned earlier that the self-conscious agenda of the Acts of the Apostles is located in chapter 1, verse 8. This is the text that you find there. But you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. Now, together with the first volume, which is the Gospel of Luke, you can actually see the way the author, whoever this Luke is, basically programmed the whole document from volume 1 to volume 2. For example, in the Gospels, it's basically the first part because it's the period of Christ. And then, of course, in the second part, you have the period of the church. So that's basically how these two documents are arranged, so that it will be able to give a comprehensive picture of what it's like in the first century Christianity. So that's Acts of the Apostles. Now, the third group would be the letters. So here in this particular, this is basically the biggest number in the New Testament. You have 21 letters or epistles. Those names are interchangeable. 13 are attributed to Paul, while 8 are attributed to others or to no one. When we use the word attributed, it is on purpose, because not all of the 13 letters attributed to Paul are considered authored by Paul himself. There are questions with some of the letters, whether Paul knew about them or Paul really wrote them. So that's why we're saying attributed to Paul, because all of them, the 13 letters, are identified with Paul. That's why when we read them, like in the liturgy, we always address them as from the letter of Paul to this place and that place. So the rest are basically attributed to others. You're familiar with them. For example, John, Peter, and then Timothy, Titus, and James, Jude. So those are the other names that are attached to the letters. Some of them, like Hebrew, the letter to the Hebrews, it's we don't know whether it's really who is this group called Hebrews in the context of the letter. So it's difficult to actually determine that. Now, according to the scholars, there is a basic standard format of an ancient letter. Basically, it contains 3 parts: opening section, the body of the letter, closing section. If you write a letter even today, I think that's still pretty much the same. You have an opening section, several things that are there, and then the body, and then the closing section. So normally in the opening section, you have the salutation, the greetings, the prayer or wish. And then in the closing section, you have exhortations, you have greetings of peace, you have prayers or wish, or giving regards to people basically in the community. So, but at least that is a common feature of a letter, especially among the ancient letters. Now, this is basically a way of grouping the 13 letters of Paul. As I mentioned, there are 13 of them attributed to him, at least put under his name. Now, it is arranged basically here in the canonical order. That means the way it would appear basically in the Bible. They are grouped this way. So the letters that are on the left side, the letters to churches, so they usually appears in this order. So you have Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. And then followed by letters to the individuals, you have 1 and Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Now, regarding authorship on the other column, so the first section is undisputed. That means these particular letters on the right upper part are basically undisputed when it comes to authorship. That means scholars are practically universally in agreement that these following letters are indeed penned, or at least Paul knew about them, like Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. The rest that you have there below on that second, on the column on the right, you find the disputed letters. 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. So scholars up to the present are still basically not sure whether these disputed texts are basically belonging to Paul, or Paul had something to do with them, or something like that. Because the suspicion is they could be written by someone else, like disciples or students in the school of Paul and so on. That's why they were able to more or less make a letter that can pass almost like a letter of Paul himself. But there are elements that needs to be considered in identifying whether a particular person could be an author of a document. They would check, for example, his Greek, the language that he uses. He would check, for example, his ecclesiology. That means that in his time he would be talking about the idea of how the church is structured and so on. Vocabulary is also very important to be able to check whether there is a close connection with the words and phrases that are being used, and even the themes that are being used in the text itself. So this is basically the 13 letters of Paul. Some are undisputed, some are disputed in relation to the authorship, but they are all canonically part of our Bible, of our New Testament Bible. Now, the next group of the letters are called the Cathosal epistles. You have the letter to the Hebrews and James, 1 and 2 Peter, 1 to 3 John, and Jude. The letter to the Hebrews, until recently, it was always been identified as Paul's letter. But of course, in recent times, you can no longer attribute Paul. You can never attribute it to Paul at this point in time. We don't know who or whoever wrote it, but it's already like different from the Pauline corpus. So these are generally the Catholic epistles. And then the third group, actually, that is basically in this list. Some of these, like for example, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, are called pastoral epistles. So they're called pastoral epistles. But the rest of the letters are generally identified as Catholic epistles. Not in the sense of the Catholic religion, but in the sense of universal. Okay, those are the letters that we have. And then the last one is basically the last group, or the last category would be the Apocalypse or Revelation. It belongs to basically that genre, apocalyptic. So this is the only example of a full-length apocalyptic work in the New Testament. That means that the whole book is almost apocalyptic. Regarding the contents, some of the observation that there are, of course, so many fantastic images in in Revelation. In fact, if you read it, you can enjoy it. At the same time, you can also be afraid of the images that you find there. That's why it has become a subject of movies, because you know that it could be really some images that could actually be put into images, into videos and movies. Regarding those fantastic images, some accuse the author of being insane or on drugs, because sometimes if you read them, they are not usually the usual ideas and so on. While there are countless literal minded believers who have been obsessed by those images as well. So, how do you read the images, symbols, and numbers that you find in Revelation? Because many people who look for these numbers, symbols, images, interpret them for different purposes. But in the context of being part of the New Testament corpus, so when you read the images, symbols, and numbers, you should not read them as literal reports, but as dimensions of visionary symbolic literature, akin to the political cartoons, with culturally understood symbols and codes, exaggerated features, etc. Are you familiar with the political cartoons? In the newspaper, sometimes there is a section where you can find political cartoons. So basically, it gives you a very weird image, but it's actually a representation of realities of at that point. So it is something that is visionary, symbolic. So Revelation is about the unseen world of heaven and about future eschatological event in order to depict the cosmic struggle between God and his enemies. So that's generally what you find in this particular book. That cosmic struggle between God and his enemies. And we always, of course, realize that at the end, it is still God that triumphs over it. Okay? So this apocalypse begins and ends as a letter. So it could actually pass for a letter as well. But anyway, because of the content is pretty much apocalyptic, they decided to just separate it from the rest of the letters. So it contains 7 messages to specific churches in Western Asia Minor. You can find it in chapters 2 to 3. That's why, to a certain degree, it has also a pastoral function like other New Testament letters. It's just that the content, which is a majority, is definitely apocalyptic, about the last things. So John writes about the present and future reign of God and the Lamb who was slain in order to strengthen, challenge, and reassure the churches in this situation. So that's the purpose for writing them, to strengthen, challenge, and reassure the churches in the situation they find themselves in, particularly when they are facing basically persecution, at least at that time. Again, the author that we're talking about here is something that is difficult as well to identify. The scholars are divided. So because John as a name is very common in early Christianity, I'm sure the Vietnamese would be able to resonate with it because there are so many Peter of them, there are so many Joseph, so many other names and so on. So in the Bible, in the New Testament times, like names like John is very common. That's why it's very difficult to really pinpoint and identify them. The style of this writer clearly differs from that of the fourth evangelist. So if the fourth gospel is according to John, this revelation is the revelation of John. They may have the same name, but we are not sure. Scholars are not clear whether they are the one and the same. So it's difficult to really determine that. But what is clear about this John is that he is clearly a respected church leader whose ministry in and around Ephesus has resulted in his exile to Patmos. So Patmos is the island where the revelation was received by this John. So that elder John was actually what you call this expelled, and then he was actually pushed to go to that island in the middle of the agency called Patmos. So if you look at the map, you'll be able to see basically where Patmos is located. It is basically in an island in between Asia Minor or Turkey and Greece today. So you'll find there the island of Patmos. So he was exiled there. Most scholars would date the work of John to the mid-90s under the Emperor Domitian of Rome. Some actually think that all or part of it comes from the 60s and alludes to the time of Emperor Nero. What is common among these emperors, these are the emperors when many of the Christian persecutions happened, especially starting with Nero and company. Now, regarding the whole collection of the New Testament, we have to recognize that even if we're looking at 4 types of documents that are contained in the New Testament, they're actually united to a certain degree. And it would be good for us to look at what unites them together. So one is that these documents are centered on Jesus Christ. The second one is that it is eschatologically conscious. That means they're always thinking of the end times, of the second coming, of the parousia, and so on. It is also scripturally defined, because if you look at the text, there are a lot of referencing that is done to, especially to the Old Testament, to the Hebrew Bible. So you can actually find those quotations both in the Gospels, in the letters, and even in Revelation. So you can find those connections to the Old Testament. It is also focused on discipleship. Most of this, or if not all of these documents, are intended for the disciples to read them, and for that purpose, that they will also be able to find some guide and direction and formation in terms of their own discipleship. It is as well counter-imperial. You can sense in these writings that there is what you call this, constant resistance against the powers that be at the time, particularly with the Roman Empire. So there are elements that you can find in these particular documents that you have. And finally, that most of these documents, if not all of them, would always indicate that in their texts that they are expectant of suffering. That means you cannot do away with the cross. You cannot do away with dying to oneself. You cannot do away with persecution, and that is basically clear in that particular collection. That's why even if there are different books and they were written at different times and different purpose on different occasions, at least you can recognize that there are basically a point of unity among this collection that we now refer to as the New Testament books. Okay? So that would be the end of my lecture today. So if you have questions, you can raise them now.